Hey everyone, welcome back to part 2 of 2 of the animated star scene tutorial. Before we start this part, there's a quick thing I forgot to mention in the last part. With your mesh selected, right click and select Shade Smooth. This is going to soften the geometry and help our shader look smoother. So starting where we left off, let's move on to creating our particles with geometry nodes. First, let's make sure our cursor is at the world origin with Shift S and then cursor to world origin. Bring in a UV sphere with mesh and then UV sphere. Size this down with S and then move it to the right. Rename this mesh to particle and then bring in another one and leave it there. Let's head over to the geometry nodes workspace. With the larger UV sphere selected, let's create a new node setup by clicking New. So looking at this setup, we get a group input and then an output. Let's bring in a point instance node with Shift A. This is going to instance whatever we specify along every vertex in this mesh. In Object, select the particle mesh we brought in. So it doesn't look like anything changed, but every vertex on this larger UV sphere is now the smaller particle one. So to see this better, let's bring in an attribute randomize right after the group input, and we're going to enter the attribute scale. Immediately, you'll see the spheres move, so let's actually decrease the max to around 0.045. And you should see what's happening more clearly. So this actually is too many particles, so let's bring in a point distribute node to decrease the density to around 2 to 3 or whatever you'd like. Let's size up the star particle sphere in general. We want these smaller particles to be glowing, so click on that smaller particle UV sphere that we also created and let's add a material on it. Go down to the Material Properties tab and click New, and let's make this an emission node and set the strength to 5. You might not see anything because we need to go to our rendered properties and turn on bloom. If you'd like to make the particle brighter, you can actually bump up the emission value to around 15. So in the example, I had this sphere rotating and then expanding in and then out. A way that we could do that is with a transform node. So let's bring that in and place it right before the point instance node. The two things that we'll want to change are the Y rotation and all the scale values in this node. So let's bring in another window and change this to dope sheet. I want to animate the Y rotation one full circle, so let's go to 0 on the timeline, hover over the Y rotation in the transform node, and then hit I to keyframe it. Then go to the end of your timeline, type in 360 in the Y, and then keyframe that. When we play it, it should rotate. I don't like this slow start, so let's click on our sphere in our timeline, hit A to select all the keyframes, then right click, go to interpolation, and select linear to remove that easing start. The next thing we'll animate are those scale values. Let's bring in a value node, and this is going to help us affect our X, Y, and Z values at the same time. We want to expand and contract our UV sphere, so let's put our timeline head at 0 for now. With our sphere selected, hover over the value node and then keyframe it with I. Then go to frame 30 and increase the value to around 1.3 or 1.5. Then hit I to keyframe that. Select those frames at 0 and then put them at 60. And then when we play this, you can see it expanding and then contracting. In order to repeat this, let's expand the sphere in our timeline. Go to Geometry Nodes and then select Default Value. Then change the dope sheet to the graph editor. Hit N in the timeline, go to Modifiers, and then apply a Cycles modifier. If we play this, it should repeat for the duration of the timeline. Now that we have this system, we can actually change the colors of the particles. So let's duplicate the original particle UV sphere 2 times, and select the first duplicate, give it its own material, and change the color to something yellow. Then select the second duplicate, give it its own material as well, and then let's change it to another color. Select all 3 spheres and then put them into a new collection with M named Particles. You'll want to make sure that you don't create new objects inside this collection. You can hide this collection as well in the Layers panel. Click back on the UV sphere with the node setup, go to Point Instance and then click Collection. Then select the particle collection that we just made, but make sure that whole collection is unchecked. And now we have different colors for our glowing particles. Let's start moving the star. Go into the Layout workspace. Then select the eyes and raise grease pencil objects and parent them to the star mesh with Ctrl P. Let's also rotate the star mesh slightly in the Y. Make sure our cursor is at the world origin and then bring in an empty with Shift A, empty, and then plane axis. Select the star particles and the star mesh and then parent it to the empty. So now when we move the empty, all of them move at the same time, and we want this star to be moving up and down. It might be easier to do this in the animation workspace. Set the camera view on the left and the 3D viewport on the right. We're going to move that empty up and down, so make sure that our playhead is at 0. We're going to bring this down a bit with G and then Z, then keyframe with I, and then select location. Go to frame 30, bring it up, and then keyframe it again with I. Then duplicate the 0 keyframes and then put them at 60. Then select Z location in the timeline and then add a cycles modifier to repeat. Now, we want this star to twirl sometimes when it goes up. So select the star mesh and go to 0 on your timeline and then press I to keyframe the rotation. Then duplicate that and put it at frame 15. Go to frame 45 and let's rotate with R in the Z by -360. Keyframe that. Then duplicate the frames at 15 and put it at 46 and 120 respectively. So basically, we just want the star to turn once when it goes up, have it skip the next one, and then do it again. To repeat the sequence, again, add a cycles modifier on the Z rotation. So now we have our particles and star animating. I want to add some line art to this mesh, and there's actually a new feature that'll allow us to do this really easily. Go into the Layout workspace and select our star mesh. Bring in a new grease pencil object with Shift A and select Object Line Art. And you'll see an outline generated around the star. This actually gets applied as a modifier, and if it looks wonky as you're navigating the viewport, don't worry because it's actually going by the camera view. Now, there's a couple of options here and feel free to explore them, but I just want to increase the thickness to around 70 to 80 and also uncheck crease and edge types. We're going to use this stroke to give the star a really intense glow. Let's go to our grease pencil layers panel and make sure use lights is checked on. And for the stroke material, let's pick something that's around a light yellow. So it'll look really dark right now, but it'll all change in just a second. The brightness comes from adding a glow effect in combination with lights. In rendered view, add a glow effect onto the line art. Change the samples to 16 and select glow under. Make sure the playhead is at 0 and let's duplicate the light in our scene, or let's bring in a new point light with 1000 watts. Situate it at the bottom of the star, and when we bring that light down, it gives us this really intense glow. If you want to keep that effect there and have it follow the star, you can just parent it to the empty and it'll animate accordingly. If you notice there's some glitching with the rays and the line art, just push the rays back so the origins aren't overlapping. Just a quick note on this. If you are planning on parenting this light to your empty, I'd suggest adding 3 more lights and placing them in the back and on the sides of the star. This is because when the star turns, the outline can appear dark in the camera if there isn't sufficient light. You can do this really easily by going into top view with numpad 7 and duplicating the light in front in those respective positions. They will still be parented to the empty. So now our star shader is a little messed up, but thankfully we've set up our shader nodes in a way that allows us to fix it really easily. Change the dope sheet to the shader editor, and let's start adjusting these color ramp values. So notice how the coverage for the B channel isn't quite working the way that we want. Let's bring in a math node right before this color ramp to help adjust it. Now we can get more of that blue. Let's do the same thing for the G channel. and adjust it however you'd like. While we have the shader editor here, let's actually go to the world shader and adjust those background values. Looking at this now, I think I want a lighter background value, something a little bit more pastel. Feel free to bump up the strength of the bottom background node, and for the top one, we can decrease to affect the color coverage. So we're almost done. The next thing that we'll want to do is to create a background star field. First, we're going to create 3 easy star particles for our field. Let's go into the 2D animation workspace and hit Shift S and make sure that our cursor is at the world origin. Enter front view with numpad 1 and then Shift A to bring in a new grease pencil blank. Also, make sure that it's in your main collection and not the previous particle collection that we created. Let's create a new layer, uncheck Use Lights, and then name it Star. Then create a new material, name it Blue Stroke, check Stroke, and then select a light blue color. Then check Fill and make it white, but lower the opacity to around 0.08. Now Control Tab in the viewport and go into draw mode. Make sure the radius is 25, the playhead is at 0, and select the box tool. We're going to create a diamond-shaped star first. Create a box around 2 squares wide, then hit A to select all of the points. And then hit R, then Y, and then type 45 to rotate it by 45 degrees. Turn on proportional editing with shortcut O, or by clicking on this icon at the top here, and using vertex select, shift select the middle vertex on each of the sides. Then S to scale it in, and you can use your middle mouse to adjust the effect of the proportional editing as well. Once you get a good diamond shape, click to confirm it, and then select all the points with A and then make any necessary adjustments. In object mode, let's duplicate this grease pencil object and move it to the right and make our second particle. Tabbing into edit mode, hit A to select all the points and then delete them with X. Go into draw mode, select the circle tool this time, and then go up to subdivisions, enter 8. Then let's draw a circle the same size as the diamond star. Tab into edit mode, enter vertex select, and we're going to use the same technique that we used earlier to create the star. Select every other vertex in this circle and scale it in to make a star shape. Then hit A to select all the points, hit R and then 18 to rotate it 18 degrees upright. Let's also change the material here. Create a new material based off this one by pressing this icon, and then change the stroke to a light pink/purple. Now tab into object mode and let's duplicate the second particle to make a third one. This is optional, but I just like having the variation. Tabbing into edit mode, hit A to select all the points, and then S to scale it down. Then in draw mode, use the circle tool to create a circle. Bump up the subdivisions to 20 for this. And after, let's duplicate the circle and put it somewhere else. It might be easier to select it in stroke select mode with 2. Now let's change the material of these elements. Create a new material off of the existing one and uncheck stroke, but increase the opacity of the white fill just a little bit. Then make any necessary sizing adjustments. So with the particles drawn, let's animate these stars. Feel free to animate them however you'd want, but for me, I'm going to keep it really simple. So let's select the blue star and go into edit mode. Make sure we're in material preview mode and have auto keying turned on. Go to frame 10 and bring up the star with G and then Z. Then duplicate the 0 frames and put them at 20. Create the in-betweens like we did before with Shift Command E or Control E, and then steps should be 5 to have one in between. Do it for the other frame range as well. So now you have it going up and down. Again, to repeat this, apply a time offset modifier, keep loop, custom range is 0 to 20, and then let's also add a noise modifier and set the strength to 0.03. This gives it a subtle shake. Then let's add in a glow effect and go into rendered preview mode if needed. Select glow under, X and Y is 25 and samples is 12. Select the pink star and we'll do the same thing. Tab into edit mode and make sure you're in material preview mode so that you can see the onion skins. Go to frame 10, bring it up, and then duplicate the 0 frames and put them at 20, and then create the in-betweens. To add the modifiers and effects, you can actually just copy them from the blue star. In object mode, select the pink star and then the blue star and hit Ctrl L. Then select copy modifiers and then do it again to copy the grease pencil effects. The only thing we'll want to do is to offset this from the blue star so they're not moving in the same direction at the same time. Go into the pink star's time offset modifier and in frame offset enter 10. For the third star, let's copy the modifiers and the effects of the blue star. Then with it selected, go into edit mode, go to frame 10, and move those circles to another location near the star. Then copy the 0 frames and put them at 20, and then create those in-betweens. And now we have our simple animated star particles. In object mode, select each one and set the origin to geometry by right-clicking each. Then select all 3 and put them in a new collection with M and then name it Animated Star Particles, and then click OK. Let's go into the Geometry Nodes workspace and set our cursor to the world origin with Shift S, and then bring in a plane with Shift A, Mesh, and then Plane. Tab into Edit mode and subdivide this with about 20 cuts. Then go into Object mode and let's size this up a bit. Before we go any further, let's actually go to those animated star particles and turn off the effects in the viewport, but not in the render. We can also hide this collection for now. Then let's create a new geometry node setup. With Shift A, let's bring in a point distribute and a point instance node. In the point instance node, go to Collection, uncheck Whole Collection, and select the animated star particles collection we just created. They're a little too large, so let's size them down with an attribute randomize node. An attribute, input scale, and set it to -0.15 for the max. We also want to tilt this star field in the X to be seen better, so let's bring in a transform node and set the X rotation to around 18. Feel free to bump up the density if you'd like. 1.5 to 2 might be great, but it might slow down your system. You can also adjust the seed as well. And now we have our star field. Another quick note on this. I mentioned some suggested values in my node system, but I encourage you to adjust those values to your liking. Depending on how you want your scene to look, your values might differ greatly from my example. With our scene done, we'll animate our camera and add some compositing effects. I want this camera to rotate around the star, so go into the animation workspace and bring in a circle by hitting Shift A, Curve, and then Circle. Let's size it up with S until it hits the camera we've placed. Then tab into edit mode and select the vertex of the circle nearest to the camera. Hit Shift S and select cursor to selected. Tab into object mode and let's bring in a plane axis empty. Let's parent our camera to the empty with Ctrl P and then add a follow path object constraint to the empty and select our new circle curve as the path. The empty will jump away from it, but just select it and apply all transformations with Ctrl A. Then select our child camera and then hit Shift S to pick selection to cursor. So now when we select our empty and adjust that constraint, it moves along the curve. Let's keyframe a value at 0, maybe like -7, then go to 180 and then keyframe 7. Then repeat the 0 keyframes at 360. We'll want to adjust the rotation of our camera to follow this movement. So with our camera selected, go to 0 in your timeline, then hit R and then Z to rotate along the Z. Then point it at our star and keyframe the rotation with I. Then go to frame 180 and do the same thing. And then duplicate the 0 frames and put them at 360. So now if you feel like the curved circle is too high, you can actually just take it down to adjust it. And now we have our camera animated. The very last thing we'll do is add some simple compositing effects. Go up to the compositing workspace and click on Use Nodes at the top. Let's bring in a glare node and a viewer node. For the glare node, set it to simple star, high, and threshold to 0.9 to get a more intense glow effect. Now we can move on to exporting. To do this, go to the output properties and select a file destination. Format should be FFmpeg video, color RGB, encoding is MPEG-4, and the output quality I usually choose is perceptually lossless. And then we can render out. This is the end of the tutorial. Thanks so much to all those who watched and participated. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and leave a comment. I hope this was helpful in getting started with some of these features to use in your own projects. If you do end up creating this and want to share your creation, tag me on Instagram at KevAndRam. And if you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing for more videos or catch me live streaming art on Twitch. My content is all about learning and becoming a better creative. Thanks again and see you next time.